My SEL tried to replace me and steal my husband. Her fantasy shattered the second my mom revealed something she never expected. My brother Kyle had been dating this woman Rachel for about 3 months when she came to her first family dinner at our parents' house. Everything seemed normal at first. She brought flowers for my mom and complimented my dad's cooking. Then when introductions came around to my husband Dean and me, she shook my hand and said, "So nice to meet Dean's current wife. I'm Rachel, his future." I thought I misheard her. Dean laughed awkwardly, thinking it was some weird joke. But Rachel kept going, looking directly at Dean and saying, "Kyle's told me so much about you. I can see why he says we're perfect for each other." Kyle looked confused and said he'd never said that, but Rachel just smiled and touched Dean's arm, saying, "Men never remember important conversations." Throughout dinner, Rachel kept positioning herself to serve Dean food first, even though he was sitting across the table from her. She'd lean over everyone to put food on his plate, saying things like, "Dean needs protein, he works so hard," or, "Dean doesn't like too much sauce, right, honey?" She'd never met him before that night. She knew nothing about him, but she acted like she'd been studying him for years. Every story anyone told, Rachel would redirect to Dean. My mom talked about her garden. Rachel asked Dean if he liked gardening because she loved men who worked with their hands. My dad mentioned his retirement. Rachel asked Dean about his retirement plans because she needed to know for their future. When I tried to join any conversation with my own husband, she'd talk over me and say things like, "Dean and I were just discussing that earlier," which was impossible because they'd literally just met an hour ago. Kyle kept trying to redirect her attention, but she'd pat his hand and say, "Your brother and I are just getting to know each other better." Family bonds are so important. The next few weeks were insane. Rachel started showing up at places Dean went. She joined his gym and would happen to be there whenever he worked out. She found out where he got coffee and would accidentally run into him every morning. She learned his lunch spot and would eat there alone, always sitting where she could watch him. She told Kyle she was just trying to bond with his family, but she never tried to run into me or my parents, only Dean. She started texting Dean constantly, getting his number from Kyle's phone. The texts started normal, asking about family stuff, but quickly got weird. She'd send him good morning messages before I even woke up. She'd text him reminders to eat lunch and stay hydrated. She'd send him articles about things she thought he'd like, even though she had no idea what he actually liked. When Dean blocked her number, she got new ones. She had at least 6 different phone numbers that we know of. Rachel would tell Kyle that Dean was texting her first, that he was pursuing her, that she was trying to be loyal but Dean wouldn't leave her alone. Kyle believed her at first because why would his girlfriend of 3 months make something so crazy up? She'd cry and say she didn't want to break up the family, but Dean was making it impossible. She actually convinced Kyle to confront Dean about bothering his girlfriend. That fight was unbelievable, with Kyle accusing Dean of trying to steal his girlfriend, and Dean showing him all the blocked numbers and psycho texts. The real explosion happened at my dad's birthday party. Rachel had convinced Kyle she needed to come despite everything, because family was important, and she wanted to show there were no hard feelings. She arrived in a dress identical to my wedding dress, which she'd somehow found photos of online. She'd styled her hair exactly like mine was at my wedding. She'd even found similar jewelry. She walked in looking like she was trying to be me from my wedding day. But that wasn't even the worst part. She'd brought a cake, insisted on bringing it out herself, and when everyone gathered around to sing, she stood next to Dean instead of Kyle. As my dad blew out the candles, Rachel loudly announced, "I need everyone's attention for something important." She pulled out a folder from her purse and said, "I've been patient and respectful, but it's time to make this official. Dean and I are in love, and I have proof." She started pulling out printed screenshots of texts that didn't exist, completely fabricated conversations where Dean supposedly professed his love for her. She had dates and times that lined up with when Dean was with me, at work, even when we were on vacation. She'd created this entire fictional affair with timestamps and everything. She kept reading these fake texts out loud. "Rachel, I can't stop thinking about you. Rachel, you're who I should have married. Rachel, let's run away together." Everyone was staring in complete shock. Then she pulled out her masterpiece, a fake pregnancy test, and announced she was carrying Dean's baby, that they'd been together for 2 months and she couldn't hide it anymore. That's when my mom, who'd been silent this whole time, started laughing. I need to analyze the continuation requirements before writing. Not a single person moved or made a sound. Everyone just stared at my mom like she'd lost her mind while Rachel stood there frozen with that fake pregnancy test still in her hand. Mom wiped actual tears from her eyes and kept laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but full belly laughs that echoed through the dining room. She finally caught her breath and looked around at all of us. "This is the most ridiculous thing I've seen in 40 years of family gatherings, and I've seen your uncle try to deep fry a frozen turkey." Rachel's face changed from that smug, triumphant look to total confusion as Mom walked straight toward her. My mom is only 5'3", but she moved across that room like she owned it, and Rachel actually took a step back. Mom reached out and plucked the pregnancy test right out of Rachel's hand before she could react. She held it up to the light, turning it slowly so everyone could see it clearly. "This is still in the plastic wrapper," Mom announced loudly. "You can see the edge of the packaging right here in your printed photo where you tried to Photoshop it out." Rachel's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Mom kept going, her voice calm but sharp. Let me tell everyone what's actually been happening here. Rachel has been dating Kyle for exactly 3 months as of last Tuesday. She met Dean for the first time 5 weeks ago at a family dinner. Right here in this house, actually. Since then, she's been stalking him at his gym, his coffee shop, his lunch spot, sending him texts from at least 6 different phone numbers that we know of. I've been keeping track of every single incident Kyle mentioned, every blocked number, every weird gym appearance, every time she showed up somewhere Dean happened to be. Mom pulled a small notebook from her cardigan pocket, and I had no idea she'd been documenting everything. Rachel finally found her voice and tried to interrupt, but Mom just held up one hand. I'm not finished. How exactly could you be 2 months pregnant with Dean's baby when you've never been alone with him even once? Dean pulled his phone out of his pocket without anyone asking and started swiping through screens. He held it up and turned it slowly so people could see his location history. I'm with Natalie or at work during every single time Rachel claimed we met up. Here's me at the office when she said we had lunch together. Here's me and Natalie on vacation when she said we were texting about running away together. The evidence just kept stacking up and Rachel's face got redder and redder. Kyle looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. He stared at Rachel and his voice came out rough and angry. What the hell is going on? Rachel's whole body language changed instantly. Tears started streaming down her face and she turned to Kyle with her hands reaching for him. Dean pursued me first. I swear. I tried to resist, but he wouldn't stop. Your family is ganging up on me because they don't want us to be happy together. She actually said that with a straight face while wearing a copy of my wedding dress. Kyle pulled away from her reaching hands and looked at Dean, then at Mom, then back at Rachel like he couldn't figure out what was real anymore. My dad had been silent through all of this, just standing by the birthday cake with candles still smoking. He cleared his throat and everyone turned to look at him. Rachel, I need you to leave my home now. His voice wasn't loud or angry, just firm and final. Rachel didn't move, just stood there crying and shaking her head. Dad walked over to the phone on the wall, the old landline my parents still kept, and picked up the receiver. You have 2 minutes to walk out that door, or I'm calling the police. That's when Rachel's whole act fell apart completely. The tears stopped like someone flipped a switch and her face twisted into something ugly and mean. She started screaming at the top of her lungs about how we were all jealous, how Dean and she had a connection none of us could understand, how she knew they were meant to be together, and we were trying to keep them apart. She was still wearing that white dress that looked exactly like mine from my wedding, and the whole scene felt like watching someone have a breakdown in slow motion. Kyle moved toward her and grabbed her arm, not rough but firm, trying to guide her toward the door. She spun on him so fast I thought she might hit him. You were just a placeholder. She spat the words right in his face. I only dated you to get close to Dean. You were never anything more than a way to meet him. The look on my brother's face made me want to grab Rachel myself and throw her out. Before anyone could do anything else, our doorbell rang and then someone knocked hard on the front door. Dad went to answer it and 2 police officers walked in, looking around at all of us standing there in this frozen, horrible moment. Our neighbor Mrs. White called about screaming, one officer said. Is everything all right here? Rachel's face changed again instantly, back to crying and scared. She pointed at all of us and told the officers we were attacking her, that she came to a family party, and we all ganged up on her for no reason. The officers looked at the situation, at Rachel in her white dress, at the rest of us clearly dressed for a birthday party, at the cake still sitting on the table. One officer asked if we could all step outside and talk calmly. Dean held up his phone before anyone moved. I have evidence of 3 months of stalking and harassment. He started showing the officer his screen, swiping through blocked numbers, saved text messages, screenshots of Rachel showing up at his gym and workplace. I jumped in and explained the whole pattern, how Rachel dated my brother just to get access to Dean, how she'd been following him and texting him constantly even after he blocked her repeatedly. The officers took statements from everyone while Rachel stood there getting quieter and quieter. When they finally spoke to her directly and asked for her side, she just kept insisting Dean had pursued her first, but she couldn't show any proof. The officers looked at Dean's phone full of evidence, looked at all of us giving consistent stories, looked at Rachel standing there alone in a wedding dress at someone else's birthday party. They told Rachel very clearly that she needed to stay away from our entire family, that if she contacted any of us again or showed up anywhere near us, she'd be arrested for stalking and harassment. Rachel walked out to the police car with one officer following her, while the other stayed to get our contact information. The second officer told us to call immediately if she contacted any of us again, and handed Dean a card with a case number written on the back. When both police cars finally pulled away, Kyle dropped into one of the dining room chairs like someone cut his strings. He put his head in his hands and started apologizing to Dean and me over and over, saying he should have believed us from the start, that he was an idiot for falling for her lies. Dean sat down next to him and put a hand on his shoulder, but didn't say anything because what could you say to that? My mom walked over and pulled out the chair on Kyle's other side. She told him that manipulative people are experts at making you doubt reality, that it's what they do best. Then she got up and went to her desk in the corner of the living room, came back with a small notebook. She'd been keeping detailed notes of every incident Kyle had mentioned, every time Rachel showed up somewhere she shouldn't be, every blocked number Dean told us about. Mom said she suspected Rachel was building towards something exactly like this, and she wanted evidence ready. Kyle looked at the notebook full of dates and times and locations, all written in Mom's neat handwriting. The rest of the evening turned into this weird processing session where everyone who'd been at the party stayed and talked about what they'd witnessed. My dad's coworker mentioned he'd noticed Rachel positioning herself to always be in Dean's line of sight during dinner. Mom's friend from book club said Rachel had completely ignored Kyle for the last hour before her announcement, acting like he didn't exist. One of our cousins pointed out that Rachel had been taking photos of Dean all night on her phone, pretending to take party pictures but always zooming in on him. Every person had noticed something off about her behavior, but nobody wanted to say anything during the party because it seemed too weird to be real. Dean and I finally left around 11 when things started winding down. We drove home in silence for the first few minutes before Dean admitted he'd been more scared than he let on. The escalation from showing up at his gym to faking a pregnancy felt dangerous to him, like she was losing touch with reality faster than any of us realized. He said he was relieved it finally exploded publicly, where everyone could see her delusion, instead of her doing something worse in private. I reached over and held his hand while he drove, and we didn't talk much after that, because there wasn't much left to say. The next morning, my phone rang at 7, and it was Kyle calling to tell us Rachel had been texting him non-stop since the police dropped her off at her apartment. He'd been awake all night reading her messages that alternated between desperate apologies and wild accusations. She claimed we'd set her up at the party, that the pregnancy test was real, and we'd somehow switched it, that Dean was lying about everything to protect his reputation. Kyle forwarded me some of the messages, and they were completely unhinged, full of caps lock and random accusations that made no sense. Dean and I sat at our kitchen table and decided right then that we needed to document everything and file for a restraining order. We spent the whole morning gathering evidence, pulling up all the blocked numbers from Dean's phone, taking screenshots of every text Rachel had sent him, writing down witness statements from everyone at the party who'd seen her behavior. Kyle came over around noon with his own documentation about Rachel's stalking pattern, including the times she'd lied to him about Dean pursuing her. 2 days later, we were sitting in the courthouse waiting area, surrounded by other people who all looked tired and stressed. A victim advocate came out and called our names, led us back to a small office. She sat down across from us and listened to the whole story without interrupting, taking notes the entire time. When we finished, she told us she'd seen similar obsessive behavior before in her work. She warned us that Rachel might escalate further before accepting that her fantasy wouldn't become reality, that restraining orders sometimes make stalkers more desperate before they finally back off. The temporary restraining order got approved that same day based on all the stalking evidence we'd brought. The judge looked through Dean's phone records showing the blocked numbers, read the witness statements from the party, listened to Kyle's testimony about the manipulation. Rachel was now legally required to stay 500 feet away from Dean, me, our home, and Dean's workplace. The advocate gave us copies of the order and told us to keep them with us at all times in case Rachel showed up somewhere. Kyle moved back in with our parents that week because he couldn't stand being in the apartment he'd shared with Rachel. He told Mom he felt embarrassed and angry at himself for not seeing through her manipulation sooner, for believing her lies about Dean. Mom set up his old bedroom and told him to stay as long as he needed. 48 hours after the restraining order was served, Dean's office building security called him to say someone matching Rachel's description was in the lobby asking for him. Security had already called the police when she refused to leave after being told Dean wasn't available. Dean stayed in his office on the 3rd floor while security kept Rachel contained downstairs. 2 police officers arrived within 10 minutes, recognized Rachel's name from the restraining order in the system, and arrested her right there in the lobby. She spent that night in jail before her parents bailed her out the next morning. 2 days after Rachel's arrest, Kyle called me around noon sounding exhausted and confused. He said Rachel's mother had just spent 40 minutes on the phone with him apologizing and crying. The woman admitted that Rachel had done this before with other men, that she'd had what she called obsessive episodes that the family thought therapy was helping control. Kyle's voice shook when he told me that Rachel's mom said they'd hoped the therapy was working, but clearly Rachel had stopped taking it seriously. The conversation got worse from there because Rachel's mother revealed details about Rachel's past that made our situation feel even more disturbing. She explained that 2 years ago, Rachel became fixated on her own sister's husband, a man who was happily married with 3 kids and had never shown Rachel any interest whatsoever. Rachel convinced herself they were soulmates despite him being completely unavailable and uninterested in her. She'd shown up at their house constantly, sent him gifts, tried to insert herself into family events, and told people they were having an affair when nothing had ever happened between them. The sister's family had to get lawyers involved, and eventually Rachel's parents moved her to another state, hoping the distance would help her move on and start fresh. Kyle felt sick hearing all this because it meant Rachel's behavior with Dean wasn't some weird anomaly, but an actual pattern she'd done before. The restraining order hearing happened a week later on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. Dean and I arrived early with all our documentation organized in folders, and Kyle met us in the hallway looking nervous about having to testify against someone he'd dated. Rachel showed up 15 minutes before the hearing started with a lawyer her parents had hired, and I barely recognized her at first. She wore a conservative navy dress with a cardigan, had her hair pulled back neatly and looked completely normal and put together. Gone was the wedding dress copycat and the manic energy from my dad's party. She acted calm and composed, nodding politely to the bailiff and sitting quietly with her lawyer, like this was just a routine misunderstanding between friends who'd had a disagreement. The judge called the hearing to order and asked Dean to testify first about the stalking allegations. Dean stood up and walked to the witness stand, then spent 20 minutes laying out the entire timeline of Rachel's behavior. He showed the judge his phone records with months of blocked numbers, screenshots of the constant texts and documentation of every time Rachel had shown up at his gym, coffee shop, or lunch spot. The judge looked through each piece of evidence carefully, asking Dean specific questions about dates and times and Rachel's exact words and messages. Kyle testified next and described how Rachel had manipulated him throughout their relationship, using him as a way to access Dean and lying constantly about who was pursuing whom. My brother's voice stayed steady, but I could see his hands shaking slightly as he explained how Rachel convinced him that Dean was the one bothering her, that she was trying to be loyal to Kyle, but Dean wouldn't leave her alone. He told the judge about the 6 different phone numbers Rachel obtained after Dean blocked her, about her showing up everywhere Dean went, about the fake texts she'd created claiming an affair that never existed. Then it was my turn to testify, and I walked up to the stand feeling angry all over again about what Rachel had put our family through. I described the wedding dress incident in detail, how Rachel had somehow found photos of my wedding online and recreated my entire look down to the jewelry and hairstyle. I explained how she'd announced a fake pregnancy at my dad's birthday party in front of our entire family, pulling out fabricated text messages with timestamps that proved she'd created an elaborate fictional affair. The judge's expression shifted from professional neutrality to visible disturbance as I talked, especially when I described Rachel standing next to Dean instead of Kyle during the birthday cake and declaring herself pregnant with Dean's baby, despite them never being alone together. Rachel's lawyer stood up after my testimony and tried to argue that his client was just enthusiastic about joining Dean's family, and that we'd all misinterpreted her friendly behavior as something sinister. He suggested that Rachel was simply trying hard to bond with her boyfriend's family, and that her actions came from a place of wanting to fit in rather than obsession. The judge cut him off immediately and said that friendly behavior doesn't include fake pregnancies, identity theft, creating fabricated text conversations, or violating someone's personal space after being asked repeatedly to stop. The judge's tone made it clear he wasn't buying the lawyer's spin on Rachel's actions. After hearing all the testimony and reviewing the evidence, the judge granted a 3-year restraining order and told Rachel directly that she needed to seek serious mental health treatment. He warned her that any further violations of the order would result in criminal charges and possible jail time, that this wasn't a game and stalking was a serious crime that he took very seriously in his courtroom. Rachel sat there looking calm and nodded like she understood, but there was something blank in her expression that made me uncomfortable. Kyle started seeing a therapist the following week to process everything that had happened with Rachel. He came over to our house after his second session and told me he felt stupid for believing Rachel's lies about Dean pursuing her, for not seeing through her manipulation sooner. I reminded him that Rachel was clearly very good at lying and making people doubt their own perception of reality, but Kyle said his therapist was helping him understand that gaslighting works specifically because it's designed to make victims question themselves. The therapist explained to Kyle that manipulative people are experts at creating confusion and making their targets feel responsible for the manipulator's behavior. 3 days after the restraining order was finalized, Rachel's parents contacted my parents directly to apologize for their daughter's behavior. They offered to pay for any security measures we needed, like cameras or alarm systems, and they promised to make sure Rachel stayed in treatment and followed the court's orders. My mom accepted their apology on the phone, but made it very clear that Rachel needed serious professional help before she hurt someone, that this pattern of obsessive behavior toward unavailable men was dangerous and couldn't be ignored anymore. My dad told them he appreciated their willingness to take responsibility, but that their daughter had caused real trauma to our family, and particularly to Kyle, who'd been manipulated and used. Dean changed his gym membership the next week and started varying his daily routine to avoid any possible accidental contact with Rachel. He switched to a gym across town, started getting coffee at different places each morning, and changed up his lunch spots so there was no predictable pattern Rachel could track. It frustrated him to have to alter his entire life because of her behavior, to give up his favorite places and routines because someone couldn't respect basic boundaries. But we both agreed that safety had to come first, that avoiding any chance encounter with Rachel was worth the inconvenience of changing habits. I watched my husband restructure his whole daily schedule and felt angry that Rachel's obsession was still affecting our lives, even with a restraining order in place. 2 weeks after the restraining order was finalized, Dean got a call from his coworker Mike during dinner. Mike asked if Dean knew someone named Jennifer Hayes because she'd sent him a friend request on social media with a message saying she was Dean's cousin and wanted to connect with his work friends. Dean pulled up the profile on his phone and his face went pale. The profile picture showed Rachel, but the hair was different and she was wearing glasses. The bio said Jennifer worked in marketing and loved hiking, but the photos were definitely Rachel in various disguises and angles. Mike said something felt weird about the request, so he looked closer at the profile and noticed it was only created 3 days ago with very few friends. Dean told Mike it was Rachel using a fake identity and asked him to report the account and block it immediately. Mike did it right there on the phone and said he'd warn the other guys at work. We called the police that same night and filed another report. The officer who came to take our statement said this was a clear violation of the restraining order because Rachel was attempting to contact Dean through his coworkers, even if the contact was indirect. He took screenshots of the fake profile and Mike's friend request message as evidence. The detective handling our case called us the next morning. He explained that Rachel's pattern suggested she might eventually move on to a new fixation, because obsessive personalities sometimes shift targets when one becomes too difficult to access. But he warned us we needed to stay alert, because these types of people are hard to predict, and some never let go of their chosen target. He said the fake social media account showed Rachel was still actively trying to find ways around the restraining order, which meant she hadn't accepted reality yet. The detective added that he'd seen cases where stalkers gave up after a few months, and cases where they persisted for years. He couldn't tell us which type Rachel would turn out to be, so we needed to keep documenting everything and reporting every violation no matter how small it seemed. Dean forwarded the detective's advice to all his coworkers in an email. He felt bad about dragging his work into this mess, but everyone was really understanding and supportive. His boss even offered to have security review their office access protocols to make sure Rachel couldn't get into the building. A month after the restraining order, Kyle called me sounding nervous. He said he'd gone on a date the night before with someone he met through a friend. Her name was Sarah, and they'd grabbed coffee and talked for 2 hours. He said it went well, but he kept second-guessing everything she said and looking for warning signs. He asked me if it was too soon to be dating again, or if he should wait longer. I told him there was no right timeline and he should do what felt comfortable. Kyle said his therapist encouraged him to start socializing again when he felt ready, because avoiding relationships completely would let Rachel's damage define his future. But he admitted he was scared of missing red flags again, and ending up with another person who seemed normal at first, but turned out to be lying about everything. I reminded him that Rachel was an extreme case, and most people don't fabricate entire personalities and stalk their boyfriend's brother. Kyle laughed and said his therapist told him the same thing. He decided to keep seeing Sarah but take things really slow and trust his gut if anything felt off. My mom organized a family dinner 2 weeks later specifically to talk about supporting Kyle. She invited me, Dean, my dad, and Kyle to her house for what she called a family meeting. When we all sat down, Mom said she wanted to make sure Kyle knew we didn't blame him for anything Rachel did. Kyle tried to brush it off, but Mom cut him off. She said Kyle had been beating himself up for months about not seeing Rachel's manipulation sooner, and she wanted him to hear from all of us that Rachel fooled everyone at first. Dad agreed and said Rachel was clearly very practiced at deception, and Kyle shouldn't feel stupid for believing someone he was dating. I told Kyle that Rachel's lies about Dean pursuing her were so convincing that even I had a moment of doubt before Dean showed me all the evidence. Dean said the fake pregnancy announcement proved Rachel had spent weeks or months planning her delusion, and no reasonable person would suspect their girlfriend was capable of that level of fantasy. Kyle got quiet, and then admitted his therapist was helping him understand that manipulative people target kind, trusting individuals, specifically because they're easier to gaslight. He said he was learning to recognize the difference between being trusting and ignoring obvious problems. The solidarity from everyone helped Kyle relax, and he actually smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. Our lawyer called me a few days later with surprising news. Rachel's therapist had contacted him to confirm that Rachel was in intensive treatment and making progress on understanding boundaries. The therapist couldn't share specific details because of privacy rules, but wanted us to know that professional help was happening and Rachel was participating seriously in her treatment program. The lawyer said this was unusual because therapists rarely reach out to victims, but in cases of severe obsessive behavior, some treatment teams believe it helps everyone involved to know intervention is occurring. I asked if this meant Rachel was getting better, and the lawyer said he couldn't make that determination, but the therapist wouldn't have contacted him unless there was meaningful progress happening. He reminded me that mental health treatment takes a long time, and Rachel's issues were serious enough that recovery would be measured in years, not months. 3 months passed without any new incidents. No fake social media accounts, no attempts to contact Dean's coworkers, no violations of the restraining order at all. Dean and I started to relax just a little bit. We still checked our security cameras every morning and stayed aware of our surroundings when we went out, but the constant anxiety began to fade. I could see Dean's shoulders weren't always tense anymore, and he stopped checking over his shoulder every few minutes when we were in public. We talked about maybe taking a weekend trip somewhere just to get away and feel normal again. The fear was still there under the surface, but it wasn't controlling every single decision we made anymore. Kyle called me excited about something for the first time since the Rachel disaster. He'd met someone new named Alyssa at a work conference the week before. They'd sat next to each other during a presentation and ended up talking through the whole lunch break. Kyle said Alyssa was smart and funny and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him. He was being cautious because of everything with Rachel, but he felt good about this. Alyssa lived 2 hours away, so they'd been texting and talking on the phone every night. Kyle said she was patient with him taking things slow and didn't push when he said he wanted to wait before introducing her to family. He told her on their second date about his ex-girlfriend who turned out to be unstable, and Alyssa was understanding instead of scared off by the drama. She shared that her own brother had dealt with a stalker ex-girlfriend years ago, so she understood how hard that kind of situation could be. Kyle sounded happy talking about her, and I felt relieved that he was moving forward. Dean came home from work one evening and told me he got a promotion. His company was expanding into new regions, and they wanted him to lead the development team, which meant he'd need to travel about once a month for a week at a time. Dean was excited about the opportunity, but worried about leaving me alone given everything with Rachel. We spent that whole evening discussing safety protocols for when he'd be away. I promised to stay with my parents or have them stay with me during his trips. We agreed I'd check in with him twice a day and keep the security system armed at all times. Dean said he'd give my parents and Kyle his full travel schedule, so they'd know exactly when I was alone. I felt guilty that Rachel's behavior was still affecting our decisions about Dean's career 6 months later, but being prepared made me less anxious about him traveling. The practical planning helped both of us feel like we had control over the situation, instead of letting fear make choices for us. 6 months after the restraining order was issued, our lawyer received a letter from Rachel's parents through their attorney. The letter stated that Rachel had moved to another state for a fresh start. Her parents provided documentation showing her new address, and proof that she'd enrolled in a treatment program in her new location. The letter apologized again for everything Rachel had put our family through, and assured us that Rachel's treatment team believed the distance from her fixation would help her recovery process. Her parents wanted us to know they were staying involved in Rachel's treatment, and would make sure she didn't return to our area. Our lawyer forwarded everything to the detective who'd been handling our case. The detective called us a few days later to confirm he'd verified Rachel's relocation with the police department in her new city. He explained that her treatment team believed physical distance from Dean would help Rachel break the obsessive thought patterns she'd developed. The detective reminded us that the restraining order was still completely valid even across state lines. If Rachel violated it by contacting us or returning to our area, she'd face criminal charges regardless of where she was living now. He said he'd keep the case file active and we should continue reporting anything suspicious, but the relocation was generally a positive sign that Rachel's family and treatment providers were taking the situation seriously. A few weeks later, Kyle called and asked if we wanted to come to a barbecue at his place because he wanted us to meet someone. Dean and I showed up with potato salad and found Kyle grilling burgers with this woman who had dark hair and was laughing at something he said. He introduced her as Alyssa, and she shook our hands with a friendly smile that felt genuine instead of forced. She asked about our drive over and complimented the potato salad without making a big production out of it. My parents arrived next, and Alyssa helped my mom carry in a dessert tray, while chatting about some cooking show they both watched. She fit into conversations naturally without trying too hard to impress anyone or dominate attention. Kyle kept glancing at her with this soft expression I hadn't seen on his face in forever. When Alyssa went inside to grab more drinks, my mom leaned over and whispered that she seemed lovely and normal, which made us all laugh because normal felt like a high compliment after Rachel. Watching Kyle smile genuinely while he flipped burgers and talked about a hiking trip he and Alyssa had planned made my chest feel warm. He looked relaxed and happy instead of anxious and confused like he'd been with Rachel. Our anniversary came up 2 months after that barbecue, and Dean surprised me by suggesting we renew our vows. He said he wanted to reclaim our marriage from Rachel's attempted intrusion and make new memories that were just about us. We planned a small private ceremony with just immediate family in my parents' backyard. My mom decorated with flowers and white chairs while my dad set up a small arch. Dean wore the same suit from our original wedding, and I wore a new dress that Rachel had never seen or copied. Kyle stood as Dean's best man and looked proud instead of guilty. When we exchanged vows again, Dean's voice was steady and sure. He promised to protect what we built together and never let anyone come between us. I promised to trust him completely and face any challenge as a team. My parents cried happy tears, and Kyle hugged us both afterwards, saying he was glad we were reclaiming this moment. The whole ceremony felt like washing away the stain Rachel had tried to leave on our relationship. After the ceremony, my mom pulled me aside and told me something I hadn't known before. She said she'd kept detailed journals during Rachel's entire stalking period, writing down every incident Kyle reported, every blocked number, every gym appearance. She'd dated each entry and included times and locations because she wanted solid evidence if things escalated further. Her foresight probably helped us get the restraining order approved so quickly since we had documentation going back months. I hugged her and thanked her for being so protective even when the situation seemed crazy. She said watching Rachel's obsession grow made her nervous, and she wanted our family prepared for whatever might happen. The journals were still in her desk drawer in case we ever needed them again for legal purposes. Kyle and Alyssa got serious enough over the next few months that he decided to tell her the full Rachel story. He called me beforehand asking if I thought it would scare Alyssa away. I told him that if she was the right person, she'd understand and support him through it. Kyle invited Alyssa over for dinner at his place and spent 2 hours explaining everything that happened with Rachel. Alyssa listened without interrupting, and then told Kyle that her brother had dealt with a stalker ex who showed up at his workplace and sent threatening messages. She understood how scary and violating obsessive behavior could be. She said it actually made sense why Kyle had been cautious about introducing her to family and taking things slowly. Kyle told me later that Alyssa's reaction made him feel accepted instead of judged. She didn't treat him like he was damaged or stupid for missing red flags. She just acknowledged that manipulative people are good at hiding their true nature until it's too late. A full year after the birthday party incident, Rachel's parents sent another letter through their lawyer. The letter explained that Rachel was doing much better in her therapy program and had accepted full responsibility for her behavior toward our family. She'd asked her parents to apologize again on her behalf, but understood that direct contact would violate the restraining order. Her therapist reported that Rachel had made progress in understanding boundaries and recognizing her obsessive patterns. The letter included documentation of Rachel's continued treatment and her stable living situation in the new state. Our lawyer reviewed everything and confirmed it seemed legitimate. The detective we'd worked with said this kind of update was actually a positive sign that Rachel's support system was staying involved in her recovery. Dean and I spent an evening discussing whether we'd ever be comfortable with Rachel apologizing directly after the restraining order expired in 2 more years. Dean said he didn't think he'd ever want to hear from her again because her behavior had been too disturbing. I agreed that we didn't need her apology to move forward with our lives. We'd already processed what happened and built our peace without requiring anything from her. But we also agreed that if Rachel genuinely changed and wanted to apologize years down the road, we wouldn't stand in her way. We just wouldn't seek it out ourselves or feel like we were owed an explanation. Some things are better left in the past. Kyle proposed to Alyssa on the anniversary of their first date at the same restaurant where they'd met. He'd planned this whole thing where the waiter brought out dessert with the ring hidden inside. Alyssa said yes immediately and started crying happy tears. Kyle called us that night from the restaurant and we could hear Alyssa laughing in the background. He sounded more excited than I'd ever heard him. The next family dinner, Alyssa showed off her ring and my mom started asking about wedding plans right away. Watching Kyle build a healthy relationship based on honesty and respect showed how much he'd grown from the Rachel experience. He didn't rush things or ignore red flags. He communicated openly with Alyssa about his fears and boundaries. He'd learned what real love looked like versus obsessive control disguised as affection. The family started planning Kyle and Alyssa's wedding over the next few months. We looked at venues and discussed guest lists and picked out flowers. There was this unspoken agreement among all of us that we'd hire security for the wedding just in case. Nobody actually thought Rachel would show up since she'd maintained complete distance for over a year. But we'd learned that being prepared prevents panic. Kyle appreciated that we took his concerns seriously without making him feel paranoid. Alyssa understood completely and said she'd rather have security there for nothing than wish we'd planned better if something did happen. My parents quietly arranged for 2 security guards to be present during the ceremony and reception. Dean's company sent him on a 2-week international trip for a major project launch. He'd be gone longer than ever before since the Rachel situation started. I helped him pack and drove him to the airport. As I watched him go through security, I realized I wasn't anxious about him being away anymore. I didn't worry that Rachel would use his absence to make contact or show up at our house. I didn't feel the need to stay with my parents or have someone check on me constantly. Rachel's hold on our peace of mind had finally loosened completely. I went home and texted Dean that I loved him and hoped his flight went smoothly. Then I made dinner and watched a movie without checking the security cameras every 10 minutes. Kyle and Alyssa's wedding day arrived 6 months after their engagement. The venue looked beautiful with white flowers and soft lighting everywhere. Alyssa walked down the aisle in a gorgeous dress that was completely her own style. Kyle cried when he saw her and my dad had to hand him a tissue. The ceremony was perfect and drama-free with no interruptions or unexpected guests. The security guards stayed in the background and had nothing to report. During the reception, Kyle and Alyssa danced together looking happier than I'd ever seen my brother. Alyssa's family welcomed Kyle warmly, and her parents told my parents how lucky they were to be joining our family. My mom gave a toast about love being built on trust and respect instead of obsession. Everyone raised their glasses and celebrated 2 people who genuinely belonged together. The whole day felt like a final chapter closing on the Rachel drama and a new beginning for Kyle's real future. Kyle stood up during dinner at the reception and tapped his glass to get everyone's attention. He thanked everyone for coming and supporting him through some tough times over the past couple years. He didn't say Rachel's name, but talked about how he'd learned the difference between someone who truly loves you and someone who just wants to control you. He said real love means respecting boundaries and building trust instead of creating fantasies and forcing connections that don't exist. Alyssa squeezed his hand while he spoke, and you could see how much calmer and happier he looked compared to when he was with Rachel. The whole room felt the weight of what he wasn't saying directly, but everyone understood. 2 years after we got the restraining order against Rachel, it finally expired, and we didn't need to renew it. Rachel had stayed completely away from all of us the entire time without a single violation or attempt at contact. Her parents reached out through their lawyer to let us know she'd built a stable life in her new city and was still going to therapy regularly. They said she was doing much better and had accepted what happened. We were relieved to hear she was getting help and moving forward with her life instead of staying stuck in her obsession. Dean and I started talking about having a baby around that same time because our lives finally felt stable and secure enough. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Rachel had faked a pregnancy to try to trap Dean, and now we were actually planning to start a family. But we refused to let her memory ruin something beautiful for us. We'd been through hell with her stalking and manipulation, but we came out stronger on the other side. 4 months later, I got pregnant, and we were both so excited and nervous. We decided to share the news at a family dinner party at my parents' house. When we announced it, my mom started laughing and said, "This is how pregnancy announcements should actually happen, with real joy and love instead of fake test props and crazy delusions." Everyone laughed and toasted to the baby, and it felt amazing to celebrate something genuine after dealing with Rachel's manufactured drama. Then Kyle and Alyssa dropped their own bomb and announced they were expecting too, due about 2 months after us. My parents were over the moon about becoming grandparents twice in 1 year. The celebration that night felt like we were finally closing the book completely on everything that happened with Rachel. Sometimes Dean and I would wonder how Rachel was really doing, and hope she'd genuinely moved past her obsessive patterns and found actual happiness. Her parents sent us a card when they heard through family connections that I was pregnant. They wrote that they were happy for our family and grateful we'd given Rachel the space she needed to heal instead of pushing for harsher legal consequences. It meant something that they acknowledged how we'd handled things, and that Rachel was apparently doing better. A few months into my pregnancy, Dean and I decided to attend a support group for stalking victims because we wanted to turn our experience into something helpful. We shared our story with the group and talked about the warning signs we'd noticed and how Rachel's behavior had escalated over time. Several people in the group said our story helped them recognize similar patterns in their own situations and gave them courage to take action sooner. It felt empowering to know that going through something so scary could potentially help someone else avoid or escape a dangerous situation. My daughter was born healthy and perfect on a sunny morning in May. When the nurse placed her in Dean's arms for the first time, he started crying and couldn't stop. He just kept staring at her tiny face and saying he couldn't believe she was real, and ours. Kyle and Alyssa came to visit at the hospital that afternoon with a huge bouquet of flowers. My brother looked at Dean holding his daughter and told him he was going to be an amazing father. Watching them together made me think about how far we'd all come from that nightmare birthday party where Rachel tried to destroy everything. 2 months later, Kyle's son was born and our kids became instant best friends, even though they were just babies. Family gatherings got loud and chaotic with 2 infants, but it was the good kind of chaos full of love and laughter. My parents were in heaven being grandparents and would fight over who got to hold which baby. Dean and Kyle started joking about their kids growing up together and maybe going to the same college someday. The whole family felt complete and happy in a way we hadn't been since before Rachel entered our lives. 3 years after the birthday party incident, we were eating at a restaurant downtown when I spotted Rachel's parents at a table across the room. My stomach dropped for a second, but then her mom saw us and smiled warmly. They came over to say hello and asked about our daughter. They told us Rachel was engaged to someone in her new city, a guy she'd met through her therapy group actually. They said she'd maintained her treatment for years now and seemed genuinely happy and stable in her relationship. Her dad said Rachel had asked them to tell us she was sorry if they ever ran into us, but she knew better than to reach out directly. They thanked us again for giving her space to get better instead of pressing charges that could have ruined her future completely. We told them we were happy Rachel found someone real and built an actual relationship instead of living in a made-up fantasy. Her dad shook Dean's hand and thanked us one more time for not pressing charges when we could have, saying it would have destroyed any chance Rachel had at recovery and a normal life. Walking back to our car that night, I felt genuinely glad she was doing better, not because I forgave what she did, but because knowing she moved on made it easier to stop looking over our shoulders. 6 months later, Dean came home with news about another promotion at work, a big jump that came with enough money for us to seriously consider a bigger house. We spent weekends driving around looking at neighborhoods with good schools and yards big enough for our daughter to run around in. The day we found our house, I knew it was right the second we walked through the door, 4 bedrooms and a huge backyard with old trees perfect for climbing. Moving day was chaos with boxes everywhere, and our daughter trying to help by unpacking her toys in every room. Dean and I worked late into the night getting the kitchen organized because we couldn't function without knowing where the coffee mugs were. Standing in our new living room surrounded by half-empty boxes, I suddenly realized I hadn't thought about Rachel in months, except when something specific reminded me, like running into her parents. She used to take up so much space in my brain with worry and anger, and now she was just this thing that happened years ago. Kyle called the next week to tell us he and Alyssa found a house 3 streets over from us, close enough that the kids could ride bikes between houses when they got older. My brother sounded so excited about being neighbors again, like when we were kids. The day they moved in, our daughter and Kyle's son played in the yard together, while the adults hauled furniture, and you could already tell those two were going to be inseparable growing up. Family dinners became a regular thing with everyone gathering at someone's house every Sunday, loud and messy with kids running around and my parents spoiling their grandkids. One night after the kids went to bed, Kyle and I sat on my back porch with beers, and he told me he was grateful the Rachel situation exploded when it did, before he wasted more time on someone so unstable. He said it led him straight to Alyssa, who was his actual perfect match, someone real who loved him for himself, not as a stepping stone to someone else. 5 years after my mom's laughter shattered Rachel's delusion at that birthday party, our family was thriving in ways we never expected. Dean and I had 2 kids now. Kyle and Alyssa were talking about a third, and my parents were living their best life as full-time grandparents. We learned through everything that sometimes the best way to handle crazy is refusing to play along with someone else's fantasy, and that real love gets built on truth and honesty, not obsession or manipulation.